also works for not multilinguals. A lot of these strategies are just best practice. They're really effective for a multilingual, but they won't harm and they actually might help others at the same time. So be thoughtful about, oh, that would actually be good for all of my kids, or that might also help these students with these needs. I think a lot of times people are like, oh, that's just for MLs. Like ML strategies work for everyone. And a lot of kids can benefit from more comprehensible input, more, explicit, more language opportunities, all of that. So welcome. We are the Reading League Utah, and I'm the events manager on the board for the Reading League. We've got Christy Bergen here, who is our president for the Reading League Utah. And really, our chapter just started a little bit over a year ago. And the whole point of the Reading League, there's a national organization, and almost all 50 states have actually joined and made their own local chapter at this point, is to really advance the awareness, understanding, and use of evidence-aligned reading instruction to support educators and meeting the needs of kids. We're all passionate about making sure all our kids become strong, capable readers. And part of that work is making sure we use really effective evidence-aligned practice. So as we kind of go through tonight, our audience is usually a mix of teachers, paraprofessionals, administrators, higher education faculty, coaches, really anyone who is passionate about literacy and wants to help kids become stronger readers. So that's just a little bit about who we are. We want to get to know you a little bit. So in the chat box, if you'll put in your name, role, and where you're coming from tonight joining us, it's always fun to see where people are coming from when they're attending these sessions. And I am Jennifer Thronson. I will be your host. You will listen to me for about 2 more minutes. And really then it will be Shannon's turn to take over. You're welcome as part of the webinar today to put questions in the chat box. We will attend to those most likely at the end, unless I feel like they're super time sensitive. And I'll be like, Shannon, could you answer this question? But most of them we will save for the end, but please put them in as when they're on your mind. It's way better just to put them on a hook that we will return to later than to keep holding on to that thought. So feel free to use the chat for that purpose. And with that said, I'm Jennifer. I will just be your host. Let's move into learning about our lovely Shannon, your presenter for the evening, and her background and what she's bringing to us. She's an educator, a literacy advocate, and a partnership consultant for Reading Horizons with a deep passion. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about Shannon is her passion for advancing literacy and learning for all kids. She holds a bachelor's degree from BYU, a master's in applied digital learning from Lamar, and is also TESOL certified, so you can feel confident she knows some things about multilingual students. She has extensive experience as an ESL and foundational literacy teacher in the K-12 virtual classroom, which you can imagine is adds an extra layer to teaching, and supports schools and districts nationwide through professional learning, implementation coaching, and thought partnership. She specializes in structured literacy. I think you'll see some of that leverage tonight, as well as educational technology to enhance instruction and really helping teachers translate research into practice. She's known for a collaborative approach. There will be a time to go into a breakout room tonight, so be ready for that. Although we're pretty small, we might end up being in here, but we'll see. And she's mother of 4 who deeply understands the power of literacy to kind of impact both the current kiddos and the future generations. So with that said, welcome, Shannon. We're excited to have you. And I am making sure we are recording. Okay, we are set. Go ahead and I will stop sharing my lovely screen so that you can share yours.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'm so excited to get to share a little bit about working with our multilingual learner students tonight. If you're watching the recording, thanks for watching. Hopefully this is helpful to you. Thank you if you're here live. Glad to see a couple of you here. I'm sure hopefully we'll grow a little bit. We were just talking about how busy the spring is in the lives of educators. So we know that you're stretched in a lot of different directions right now. So hopefully what we present tonight is going to make your lives a little bit easier and not add anything more difficult to your plate. But yeah, so I'm Shannon and I love literacy, but I also have a special place in my heart specifically for multilingual learners because that's kind of my background. That's who I worked with initially, and they're just so sweet, and they work so hard. They have to work so hard to kind of stay with the group, right? And so I just have a special place in my heart for them. So a little bit about me. You heard that I have 4 kids. They're all teenagers or young adults. and some fun pictures of me with some of my students. They're so adorable. And tonight we are going to be jumping into some strategies to support these fun students. And there are a couple just science of learning things that I'm going to ask of you tonight to help us all take as much away from the learning as we can. This is always a little more tricky on Zoom, so don't feel like obligated, but there are going to be some opportunity for choral responses, specifically to read aloud certain parts of quotes that we're going to be looking at. It just kind of helps everybody stay together and engaged. Structured partners, we're actually not going to do structured partners tonight, but in your classroom, you should do structured partners rather than just turn and talk and whoever's the stronger speaker is going to take the lead. And then we will do some retrieval opportunities and some reflection, and we'll have some opportunity to speak together as a group. So depending on our numbers, we might go into breakout rooms. We might just kind of stay in the main room together and share out. But basically, don't be shy. I want to hear from you too. So what we're going to cover is a little bit of outline of what we're going to do. We're going to first just speak about the multilingual learner population, and specifically even to Utah. So if you're joining us from another state, take that with as you will, but you can look up your own multilingual learner population on the internet. We'll also then go into some different domains of literacy and talk about ways we can support students in word recognition, vocabulary, comprehension, oral language, and writing. So we'll spend some time in there and then we'll recap kind of those shifts that we discussed. All right, so let's jump into it. So first of all, you'll notice whenever I have a quote on my slides, there's some of it that might be bolded. Those are the parts that you can read along with me to stay engaged. So first, let's talk about this student population of our multilingual learners. English learners are the fastest growing subpopulation of students in public schools. So we're growing quickly. We're seeing that number increase across the country. This map is, as you see, from 2021. So already you might see some shifts in these numbers. In Utah specifically, about 10% of our student population are multilingual learners. Of those multilingual learners in Utah, about 75% of them speak Spanish in their home. That's their home language. And you might hear me referring to home language or L1, first language, but really some of our multilingual learners, and that's why we use that term more often, speak multiple languages, not just an L1 and English, right? So just kind of keep that in mind. There's lots of terminology that floats around in this space, but that's primarily what I like to use as multilingual learners and home language. So lots of Spanish, about 3/4, right? Oh, I almost said 2/3. You guys, math is not my thing. So 3/4 is the right ratio there. After that, we have an interesting mix in Utah, but primarily our next top 3 languages, home languages, are Arabic, Somali, and Vietnamese. So I'm always curious, if you work with multilingual learners at your school or in your district, I'd love to hear if there are other languages represented in your schools or districts. So if you want to throw in the chat any additional languages that you've encountered in your practice or with your students, I'm always just curious to see what we are, looking at in the state of Utah. I was in a meeting yesterday with a group, and we were talking about a large Somali population of students in Salt Lake City. So that's an interesting one, but that's represented here. Oh, Christy says Portuguese. Okay. Oh, Russian. Interesting. Mostly Spanish. Yes. Yeah. Sometimes we kind of have some different experiences depending on where we live. Wonderful. Okay, well, I will tell you right now that even if your students speak a language other than Spanish or coming to you with that background in another language other than Spanish, all of the strategies we're going to talk about are still going to be applicable. So what's interesting is that while this subpopulation of students is the fastest growing and that we're seeing a pretty large representation in most states, some higher than others, Utah's not the highest, but also not the lowest. Even though that's true, we'll look at this quote, fewer than 3% of teachers have the specialized certification to work with this group of students. So very few of our teachers have an ESL endorsement or are TESOL certified or have any kind of specialized training in how to work with multilingual learners. And so it's a really big need. I hear it a lot, like, well, but what do I do about my students who are coming to me as language learners? Well, a lot of the things that we're doing, best practices in the classroom, are best practices for multilingual learners as well. So you'll see some overlap. And to that point, I wanted to just briefly show Scarborough's reading rope. This is probably pretty familiar to everyone, so I won't spend a lot of time going into it. However, what we're going to talk about, these domains of literacy tonight, are all going to kind of fall into this model, right? Our word recognition skills, language comprehension skills, where we see things like vocabulary and language structure represented. And then as those skills develop and weave together over time, students become skilled readers. Now, what's not represented on Scarborough's reading rope that we also want to take into consideration, because it's all part of literacy, is oral language and writing. And so we'll be talking about those pieces as well, because those all weave in together. They're all related. All right, let's jump in. The first domain that we're going to really address is word recognition. Now, word recognition typically refers to skills like phonemic awareness, phonology, decoding, so phonics, high frequency words, things like that. I'm going to be quoting Elsa Cardenas-Hagen's book a bit because it is a really excellent resource if you work with multilingual learners and you're wanting to know more. It's pretty approachable and it gives you some good practical things to take into your classroom as well. So it looks like this. It's the orange book. So it's easy to find if you're searching for it. I wanted to pull this out specifically. The National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Children and Youth systematically examined the research on acquiring literacy in a second language. Recommendations for those students include incorporating foundational skills such as phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency while developing fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension skills. Yeah. Now, do those look familiar to us? Yes, they do, right? Those are the same things that were identified by the National Reading Panel as sort of those big five, or if you've seen kind of that pyramid version of those five skills, phonology, decoding or phonics, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension at the top. The same skills are just as important for our multilingual learners. So what you're learning, if you've been involved in learning about the science of reading, or you've done some training around that, maybe you've completed letters or some other type of science of reading professional learning, those same things that you know about the reading brain apply to your multilingual learner students. Now we're going to do a quick little activity that leads into talking about phonology. So I want you to just take like 10, 15 seconds and look at this sentence and think about how many F's are in this sentence. Just take a look for a minute. How many do you see? It's just a sentence, so I'm sure you've had time to read it, but there are 6 F's in this sentence. Now, you might have missed one or two, and that's typically because it can be challenging to identify the letter F if it is in a word like of, where it's making a different sound than its traditional sound. And so sometimes that can be tricky. And interestingly, Dr. Emerson Dickman has discussed that the blind are better readers than the deaf because reading is closer to hearing than it is to seeing. So good readers have really developed well-established neural connections to the speech areas of the brain, which makes sense if we think about the building blocks of reading and the fact that human brains are wired for speech, but we have to build those neural connections for reading, connection to letters and graphemes, right? So phonology as the basis makes a lot of sense, and also makes a lot of sense that students that have that skill of connection to the speech areas of the brain are going to pick up on this quickly. And that kind of leads us to this idea of cross-language transfer. So there appears to be cross-language transfer of phonological awareness skills. Students who have the capability to process and manipulate sounds in a first language are likely
Likely
to do
to
the
do the
same
same
in a
in a
second
second
language.
language.
Yep. So, if students have that ability in their home language, we can leverage that because that skill will transfer into English as we're working with them in the classroom. One of the key things about this, and really about everything, I'm going to come back to this multiple times, is making connections. The more that you know about your student's home language and the similarities and differences between that home language and English, the more you're going to be able to support those students in the classroom. So, for example, in phonology, knowing more about the similarities and differences between languages makes a huge difference. So, for example, we're going to use Spanish because that is the majority of our multilingual student population in Utah. But in Spanish, there are not initial S blends. That's not something that is used in Spanish. Whereas in English, we do have those. There are only 5 vowel sounds in Spanish. Makes it so much easier. In English, we have a lot, 14 or more, depending on how you're looking at it. So those are some differences between the two languages. And then there's also, of course, lots of overlap and similarities. Both languages use the Roman alphabet. They both have voiced and voiceless pairs, which is a huge overlap that is going to help our students. And Spanish cognates in English make up 30 to 40% of words. There's a lot of overlap, or cognates, we'll talk more about that, within those two languages. So there's quite a bit of similarity between Spanish and English. And knowing those similarities and differences helps us as teachers to identify where we can provide some quick wins for our multilingual learners as we show them those connections and similarities, and where we want to focus our instructional efforts on those areas that are different. Now, there's a lot of overlap between Spanish and English. You may be working with students whose home language is more dissimilar to English. For example, like in Utah, some of our other languages, Somali, Arabic, those are quite different than English, especially languages like Arabic that are not even using the Roman alphabet. So we have more that we have to kind of teach explicitly. However, there we go. Hopefully, with that gets us where we want to be for anyone who's watching the recording. Um, so what I was going to say is any AI tool you can use to help you kind of find those similarities and differences. Another website that's useful is mylanguages.org. Mylanguages.org. I'll go ahead and put that link in the chat. But this is another website that will give you actually quite a bit of information about various linguistic crossover. But I went ahead and put that there for you. Okay, so making connections between the home language and English is a huge shift we can make to help support our students in the classroom. Now, the next one is explicit instruction. This is not new. This is good for all of our students. We know this. Anita Archer is, the guru of explicit instruction. And I love this kind of graphic of being able to show everything that should go into an explicit instruction lesson. Specifically, I wanted to note that within the body of the lesson, we're following that gradual release of responsibility model. I do, we do, you do. And as we're doing that, we are focusing on critical content. So teach the stuff, cut the fluff. That's an Archerism that I love. We also want to break down complex skills into smaller units, always for all of our students, but that is going to support your multilingual learners as well. Requiring frequent responses, getting lots of language interaction is going to be good for all learners, and providing feedback to our students. Again, good for all learners, but also particularly helpful for our multilingual learners. So explicit instruction should be happening in decoding, phoneme, grapheme mapping. We need to be teaching sounds, of course, and then mapping those to the letters that spell those sounds. Teaching orthographic conventions or spelling patterns. Syllable and stress patterns, high frequency words, and morphology fall under that as well. So we're going to talk a little bit more about morphology later. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how to teach that. I do have a really some great resources to share about how to explicitly teach those decoding skills, but I'll share those at the end. However, I wanted to come back to this idea of I do, we do, you do, that gradual release of responsibility that is such a hallmark of explicit instruction, because it doesn't always look the same for all of our students. We might think, okay, I'm going to model it, then we're going to do it together, some guided practice, and then the students can be able to do it on their own. Well, that's just not always the reality that we live in. And every student might be a little different. Sometimes it might look more like this. We need lots more of that we do practice with feedback. Maybe they need more of that you do practice. They're starting to get it, but they're not there yet. Maybe they need a lot more of that. And this is true of our multilingual learners. It's not always a linear process. And even in this example here, I do, we do, we do, we do, we do, you do, you do, you do, it still might not even just stay in that piece, right? Like as we get to you do, we may discover, oh, nope, for this, we've got to go back to some we do, or I need to do a quick I do and do a quick reteach here before we can move to the next, level of independence for the student. So it's not always a linear process. Take the time and repetitions that are needed for your students to get to independence, to get to mastery, to get to automaticity with each skill. I recently was in Oakland for a conference, and I heard Zaretta Hammond giving a keynote, and she said something that really stuck with me. She said, automaticity is equity. And that really hit me because that's true, right? If that's the problem, is if we don't get our students to automaticity with skills and we move to the next skill that builds cumulatively, we're leaving them on a shaky foundation. And that's where we kind of lose that equity. And that's true of all of our special populations. But automaticity is equity. I thought that was really interesting. So this is how we get them there to automaticity, is making sure they get those repetitions and the opportunities to practice independently. Okay. So one of the small shifts I wanted to share tonight was, as part of that gradual release of responsibility, explicitly teaching the lesson, modeling the skill first for students, then moving into guided practice. One of the great practices you could do is dictation. This is my favorite part of any explicit lesson. It's usually my students' favorite part as well, because it's super powerful in building the neural connections in the brain that are needed for students to become automatic readers. But it's also engaging, it's multimodal, we're using lots of language, and we're getting lots of repetition. So during dictation, we're connecting what students hear with what they see written out, and then back to what they read out loud. So they're going to hear it, say it, write it, and read it, kind of that process. So if you're not familiar with this, in the process of dictation, the first step is to just make sure we have everybody's attention, that we don't have anyone wandering off looking away. So whatever your attention grabber is, get your students' attention. The next step is that the teacher is going to dictate the word or item. It might be a letter or a letter sound or a part of a word. You're going to dictate that item twice. So for example, if I'm working with the word bag, I'm going to say it twice. Bag, bag. Then the students will repeat that word twice. Bag, bag. Next, we're going to provide a context sentence. We put the groceries in the bag at the store. We might also, for our multilingual learners, provide additional supports like a definition of what a bag is, or we might just use some realia or a prop to show them what a bag is, a visual or a picture, something like that. The next step is for students to write that word on a whiteboard or piece of paper, whatever it might be. They're going to write that word on their whiteboard, for example. And then they're going to read the word back twice. Bag, bag. The last step is to have the student use the word in a context sentence, or to demonstrate another way of them understanding that word. If they're like newcomers, they may not be producing complete sentences yet. However, if they can, we want to encourage as much verbal output as we can, because if you've ever tried to learn another language, verbalizing your thoughts is the hardest, scariest part of that. And that's true for our multilingual learners too. That can be very intimidating. So anytime that we can foster lots of verbal output, we want to do that. So this process of dictation is so awesome. I have students stand during dictation. We have some hand movements we might do depending on their age group. But very engaging and very supportive. We don't want to skimp on the dictation process. For our multilingual learners, that repetition, the variety of modes, that practice for pronunciation and vocabulary acquisition are all playing into supporting them in this process. Okay, so that's a key piece. Now we're going to shift a little bit into the domain of vocabulary, which falls under our language comprehension skills. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here because vocabulary is such an essential piece for our multilingual learners. And as Dr. Motes says in this quote, as children progress in reading, the variance between good readers and poor readers is increasingly explained by students' knowledge of vocabulary. The more vocabulary one commands, the more fluid and accurate one's reading knowledge. So it's almost kind of like that Matthew effect that you might have seen. The rich get richer, the poor get poorer. And that's true in vocabulary because one of the best ways to acquire more vocabulary is by reading. And so if our students are poor readers or they're new to the language and reading is difficult, they're not exposed to nearly as much rich vocabulary content as their peers who are stronger readers. So this is going to be really important for our multilingual learners to provide explicit vocabulary instruction. This is something that you might have seen before. We're going to look at the different tiers of vocabulary words. So we're not talking about tiers of instruction, gen ed, intervention, that kind of thing. We're talking about types of words and their frequency and their application. So for example, tier 1 vocabulary words are kind of those everyday words we hear in conversation. So words that your multilingual students might be exposed to just through talking or hearing peers on the playground. They might hear things at the store. So for example, like a word water or dog, they might be exposed to that elsewhere, right? We might not have to teach as many of those tier 1 words explicitly. Tier 3 words are limited to specific domains. So these are words that we have to know to understand more specific contexts and content areas. So for example, a word like photosynthesis is a more complex word that we really only need to know when we're learning about photosynthesis in science. It's not something we need to know all the time. So we do want to explicitly teach these, but we want to teach them connected to the content that they support. And then tier 2 words are those high utility academic words that are used in all different content areas that are going to show up for students on tests and assessments, or in word problems or in text prompts, all of those types of things. So for example, the word transfer or summarize or I'm trying to think of another one off the top of my head, but those are good examples, right, of words that they're going to hear in a lot of different areas that they need to know. And interestingly, you would think that tier 1 words represent the most words, but they only actually represent about 25% of vocabulary words, whereas those tier 2 words represent a larger number of vocabulary words students need to know. Tier 3, of course, is domain specific. It's going to be a little smaller, 6 to 13%. Lots of science, though. If you're reading in a science text, look at that, how that number jumps. If they're in science class, maybe you're working with a multilingual learner in high school, that science text is going to be heavy with those tier 3 words. However, the most bang for our instructional buck with vocabulary is typically going to be found in tier 2 words because those are going to apply across all content areas. With our multilingual learners, use what you know about the student's language ability to determine where you focus your vocabulary instruction. If you're working with newcomers, you might need to teach some of those tier 1 words explicitly because we need them to understand just basic text that we're working with. When we introduce new vocabulary to students, there's a 4-part processing model that we're going to kind of think about and connect for students. The first area of the brain we're going to activate and connect is the phonological processor. So the first thing is to say the word out loud. For example, note. They hear it, they're listening for that sound. The next step is to connect it to the orthographic processor. This is what's processing the letters that spell those sounds. Together, that's the phoneme grapheme connection that we're teaching when we're teaching decoding and phonics. So we hear it, note, We see it written out. We understand what letters represent those sounds. And then we're immediately building to the meaning processor, giving students a good definition for that word, supporting that with visuals as needed, and then building to context. So the meaning of the word, get that picture in the brain, and then put it into context so they understand how the word works within the language. I left a note for my mom on the counter. So a note, it can be like a written reminder or a short letter. Those are some ways we could define that. This four-part processing model happens very quickly. And I think a lot of us as teachers do this automatically, right? We're going to teach the word, we're going to have them say it and repeat it, show it to them, help them understand what it means, use it in a sentence. That's basically the process here. In English and in other languages too, some of our words have multiple meanings. So for example, note can mean a written reminder or a short letter, but it could also mean like a musical sound. It could also mean like a hint of, right? Like I detect a note of cinnamon in these oatmeal cookies. We might hear that word used in different contexts depending on multiple meanings. So we can also teach additional meanings as we're building vocabulary for students. Okay. When we're teaching vocabulary, introducing new words, we want to always combine new information with what the learner already knows. That is always going to stick better. We know that students can do this. We can do this more easily as teachers, and students are going to pick it up if we connect it to themes. So if we're teaching vocabulary, thematically related words, then that's going to give students some prior knowledge to attach those words to. Of course, multiple exposures. Students need 10 to 12 opportunities to use a word in a variety of contexts before it is really officially part of their lexicon. And then language interactions that involve that vocabulary, speaking, listening, reading, and writing activities that involve that vocabulary are also going to help that word move into long-term storage more quickly. So just a quick retrieval opportunity. We just looked at the four-part processing model of introducing vocabulary. It's not a quiz. You don't have to get it right, but let's just see what we remember. Can you remember what those four processors were that the brain is going to use to facilitate long-term storage of new vocabulary? You can put it in a chat. You can just think about it. Research says if you write it down, it's better, but yes. Quick. Yep, phonological, orthographic. So phonological sound, orthographic, the writing, the print, meaning, and then context. Yeah, or semantic, the meaning of the word. Perfect. And then context. Great job. All right. So we talked about how we're introducing vocabulary. Now, I have a couple really helpful resources that I'm going to share with you that align with some of these kind of moves that we're going to talk about next. So a small shift that you can do with your multilingual learners when you're introducing vocabulary is to use bilingualized definitions. Now, this is not rocket science. It's just kind of common sense maybe, but something that we might not always do or think we have access to. So a monolingual approach to introducing a new word would be to just give the word in English, like cat, and give an English definition. A small domesticated carnivorous mammal with soft fur, a short snout, and retractable claws. Okay, let's pause there for just a second. Even if our students were native English speakers, what's problematic about this approach that I just showed you? You're laughing, Christy, because it's just kind of silly, right? We're like, what? There's a lot of big words in that definition. Domesticated, carnivorous, mammal, retractable. These are a lot of really big words. So we do want to be mindful that we are giving a learner definition. Use more simple language when we're giving that definition to students. So maybe a small animal that's related to lions and tigers and that's often kept by people as a pet. That's going to be a more approachable learner definition for our students. Okay. Nonetheless, this is not leveraging what the student might already know about this vocabulary word in their home language. This is just giving them the English word, the English definition. A bilingual approach would be giving them the vocabulary word cat and then just giving them the translation into their home language. If it's Spanish, gato, right? And they're like, oh, okay. Like they got it because they know that word in their home language. The best approach is that bilingualized approach where we combine the two. We want to give them the word in English and an English learner definition so that they can start practicing related words that have to do with that word and give them the translation to their home language. That way, they're making the connection to what they already know and they're hearing additional language having to do with that vocabulary word in the learner definition. So, this is one way that you can support students as you're introducing vocabulary. It's a pretty simple shift. Now, what I was saying before is that we may not do this sometimes simply because we don't know the word in their home language, or we are having a hard time coming up with a good learner definition. So, what I'm going to share at the end of the session are some links to some customized GPTs that if you like to use AI, you're welcome to use, but they're really great tools. So this one is a bilingualized dictionary GPT. And so if you put in whatever your vocabulary word is, for example, language, it's going to give you a learner definition and it's going to give you a translation into whatever languages you ask it for. So you do have to specify which languages you want, but this is really helpful if you're working with a group of multilingual learner students who do not all speak the same home language. So you can get that translation in multiple languages. The other thing I love about it is that it will give you phonetic pronunciations for words in a language that's not Roman alphabet based, right? I don't read Arabic, so I wouldn't know how to tell the student that translation, but it does give you that phonetic pronunciation there. And if it's not quite right, that phonetic pronunciation, I promise your students will probably be able to tell you, like, yeah. And then they'll tell you how to say it and you can practice, which is also fun. That's one of the things I love about working with multilingual learners is that like we get to learn from each other a lot, which is cool. Okay, so bilingualized definitions, you can use that bilingualized dictionary tool. What other instructional supports might we use when we're introducing new vocabulary with our multilingual learners? I mentioned a few of them earlier, but what else do you do to help those students connect to new vocabulary? You can throw it in the chat, you can unmute. Yeah, there's a lot of things we can do to support, and especially if the word is more concrete. It gets a little trickier when we get into introducing like tier 2 vocabulary that might not be something that we can like show a picture for. But absolutely, pictures, short videos are a lot of fun. And with access to all kinds of resources like that, it's really easy to pull something up. Gestures, total physical response, coming up with a movement that aligns with that meaning. Realia or props. Yep. Those are all great supports that we can use. I love it. Maybe we can even build, sometimes we might label things like in the classroom. Sometimes we'll label things that help students, especially newcomers, start to get familiar. We might create a word wall. So as we introduce vocabulary and it's part of what we've learned, we might put it up there so we can remember it and reference it. I love it. This is another fun activity that you might do to help support your students and give them lots of language interaction with a new vocabulary word. We call this activity Four Corners, and it can be customized. Each activity in the corner can be different depending on the age and language development of your student. But in this example, we've got the word brain. That's our English word we're learning. You can have the translation to their home language there, an illustration, use it in a sentence in both English and their home language. And if you're using some kind of decoding system, you can also have that there, or maybe you have them do a synonym or some other kind of language practice in that other corner. Okay, so that's a fun one. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about morphology next, because morphology can really accelerate vocabulary development for your multilingual learners. Our language, English, kind of gets a bad rap, right? With our students, with anyone who's learning it as an additional language, because it can be challenging and it can seem like there's no rhyme or reason, which is not actually true, but it can feel like that sometimes because there are a lot of less common patterns or exceptions or things we've borrowed from a bunch of other languages. However, English can also be a little tricky because it's morphophonemic, meaning that it's our spelling is representing both the sounds, right? The letters represent sounds, but also it's holding the meaning. And so sometimes we think, why is that spelled that way? And sometimes it's spelled that way because it's retaining some kind of meaning. And so if we understand that, we're going to be able to help our students understand that better as well. So for example, if we read this word, what is this word? Heal, right? What about now? It's changed a little bit. How do we pronounce that word now? How? Yes, exactly. So it's changed, the vowel sound has changed. However, the spelling of that base word has not changed because it's retaining that meaning of the root word. Okay, so understanding the morphophonemic nature of English is going to help not only you as a teacher, but also your students to kind of make sense of English. And that's kind of what's fun about it, is helping students like not get overwhelmed, simplifying it for them. And morphology makes a huge difference because it's just not efficient for us to memorize thousands of words. We can't do that. Whereas if we teach morphology word parts that carry meaning, we can teach, just a handful of word parts, and students can apply that across many, many, many words. And so it unlocks a lot more vocabulary for those students. You can think of it this way: morphology is generative. So as they learn additional word parts, and all of our word parts that we're teaching are meaningful, they're going to be able to create words. They're going to be able to break down words more efficiently. So, for example, if we're looking at these two words, rebuild and builder, we can recognize that there's a common base word here, right? Build. And we can explicitly teach the meaning of that word using a bilingualized definition, right? A simple learner definition translated into their home language. But to build is to construct something by putting parts together. And if we also know the meaning of the affixes that are part of this word, so we've got the prefix re here, which means again, so to build again, and er at the end, a suffix here telling us like one that does. So someone who builds is a builder. Then we have unlocked so many more words for our students. Now, there's a variety of ways that you might teach this, but this is just kind of a generic outline of how you might start introducing common affixes in morphology. Typically in early grades, we're focusing more on teaching the phoneme grapheme connections first so that students have that solidly. And we might introduce some simple inflectional suffixes like S for plurals, ED, ING. And then as we move into having a firmer grasp on the decoding piece, then we add more and more morphology to help unlock meaning of many, many words. So these are just examples here, not like any specific scope and sequence, but just to show how that's going to build over time. So especially if you're working with middle grade students, look how many we can teach. That's going to unlock so much vocabulary. Some supports you might use for this, you might use some word sums, as you see at the bottom here. This is from a resource called Spelling Shed. And word sums are great for younger students because it's very visually obvious that we're combining the base word trouble with the suffix S. That's going to give us the word troubles, right? You could also use word matrices. This is a great option, especially for like a little bit older learners, because these might be a little more visually complex. But this is allowing students to build many, many words based on the pieces that they know. And these morphology matrices are from a website that I will put in the chat, neilramsden.com. Put that in the chat for you if you want to grab that. You could play a fun game with this. Like after you've taught some of these, obviously you don't have to include any you haven't explicitly taught, but you can play a fun game called Beat the Clock, where you give your students a certain amount of time to create as many words in the word matrix as possible. And they're just going to write as many words as they can, showing them how they can build those words. We won't do it right now. Okay, but this allows us to build morphological word families. And there's also a GPT that I'll share with you that helps you do this, where you put in a head word like teach, and it's going to give you a word family, all those words that can be built using additional affixes to that base word teach, teaching, teacher, teachable, teachability. That's a lot. That's multiple suffixes, right? Okay, so morphological word families, morphology is generative, huge way to support and unlock meaning for your multilingual learners. The next thing, we have two quick little things we're going to talk about in vocabulary, then we'll move on. But collocations is one. Collocations is a term you might not be real familiar with. It just means like lexical patterns. So it's words that go together naturally that sound right to a native speaker, if that makes sense. It's not the same as pragmatics. Pragmatics is more about how we're using the language to achieve goals or like the context or intention with language. And it's not exactly syntax. Syntax is more like the sentence structure, grammatical word order. However, there is sort of an intersection, right? So essentially, this is like phraseology. You can kind of think of it that way. So, like in English, for example, a collocation might be we have to make a decision. And that's how we say it. We would say, I have to make a decision about which school I'm going to send my preschooler to. We wouldn't say I have to do a decision. That would sound weird to us as native speakers. Another example might be, well, gee, I hope he doesn't commit a crime. Like we say commit a crime. We don't typically say do a crime. Like that doesn't sound as natural to us. So these are more just like phrases that are common in the language. And they happen in all languages. Like I call myself a forever Spanish learner because I don't know if I'm ever going to like count myself as fluent, but I've been learning Spanish for a really long time. And in early days of Spanish, I would have directly translated from English to Spanish. So I would have said, like, necesito hacer una decisión. Hacer means to make. That's how I would have said it because that's how I would have said it in English. But in Spanish, that's not how they would say it. They would say tocar una decisión, which means to take, literally. So, like, I wouldn't say it that way because I am not familiar with how that works in the language. So this is something that we can explicitly teach students if there are some of those phraseologies that we encounter in language. And that can help students with context, giving them some of those patterns, but also helping them just to feel more confident with their language, especially as they are producing language with their peers. Right. And so you can use a GPT for this as well. Especially if you're trying to think of how you would teach this, put in your word, like, for example, momentum. This is a big word. But then it will give you different outputs showing how this word might be combined with either an adjective or a verb. These are common phrases you might hear with the word momentum. The momentum gained considerable movement or great movement. Those are things we might say. Okay, let's talk about cognates. Cognates are words that come from the same origin as a word from a different language. So they sound similar, they're typically spelled similar, and they have the same meaning. And that last piece is really important. So for example, in Spanish, the word grupo is a cognate for the English word group. They sound similar, they're spelled similar, and they mean the same thing. In English, the word family has the cognate familia in Spanish. Right? Sound similar, mean the same thing. However, there can be false cognates that sound similar and are spelled the same, but do not have the same meaning. So for example, the word ropa in Spanish means clothing, not rope. So that would be like a false cognate. Or the most, popular false cognates is the word in Spanish, embarazada does not mean embarrassed. It means pregnant. So not the same meaning, even though they sound very similar and are spelled very similarly. Okay, so cognates, there's a lot of overlap there. Remember at the beginning of the presentation, we looked at how many cognates there are between Spanish and English, about 30%, lots of overlap. This is going to help our students acquire language more quickly, have more confidence, be able to figure out vocabulary, especially within text, give them those quick wins, and also support comprehension. So lots of benefits to explicitly teaching cognates and also explicitly teaching which are not real cognates. So there's a GPT for this as well that will create real and false cognates between English and whatever languages you choose. So this is interesting. I did this for a couple different languages in the GPT, and there were some, I never would have known because I'm not familiar with, Vietnamese. So it was interesting to see what cognates still exist, even in languages that seem very dissimilar. Okay. All right. So those are kind of my big vocabulary moves, and I'll share those GPT resources and tools with you at the end. In our last little bit of time together, I wanted to focus in on a couple of things we can do in other domains that we haven't talked about yet. So comprehension, vocabulary kind of falls under comprehension, language comprehension. But syntax is one that I wanted to talk about, sentence structure. So it's really important that we explicitly teach sentence structure to our multilingual learners because it's usually different than the syntax in their home language. And so you can't just direct translate things like I was talking about with collocations, English to Spanish, because that's not the way the word order in their home language. So we have to explicitly teach correct sentence structure. You could do different activities, like starting with just the most basic sentence structure is we have to have, a who and a do, a subject and a verb. So Sid likes juice. Meg is riding her bike. We might start with those really simple sentences and then add on to them as we explicitly teach additional words and teach how these fit within sentences. So if we were going to add an adjective to the sentence, Sid likes juice, maybe we'd add Sid likes orange juice. What about for Meg is riding her bike? Which adjective might you add?
I'm going with green.
Ooh, where would you put it in the sentence?
In front of bike. Meg is riding her
Yeah,
green bike.
because it's describing the bike, exactly, or new bike, or old bike, or any of those things. Fast bike. I forgot about that one. That was a good one. All right, so practicing with sentence structure is going to be really important. And we can practice both sentence structure and decoding and a variety of our skills, including vocabulary, within text. So we always want to move things out of isolation into text. And initially, we want to be in decodable text because we want them, this is about 50%, maybe even more of a lesson in application, applying a skill to reading and writing, because that's where students retain a skill. You can tell if students don't retain a skill over time. That's always my first question to the teacher or to the coach or whatever is like, well, how much application are they doing? If the teacher's just doing, I do, and they're not getting a lot of we do and you do in there, then that learning's not going to stick. So as far as decodable texts go, there are a lot of resources out there. I put a couple here, a couple AI tools that you can, oops, I forgot I can't pull it straight from the slide when I'm presenting. Sorry, I'll share it with you at the end. But the AI tools that you can use, there's Project Read has a great tool. There's a teacher tool AI one that works really well, ChatGPT. It's okay. It depends on what you put in, how good it's going to be spitting out good decodable text. And if you're looking for print decodable text options, the Reading League's website has a whole section of decodable text sources that you could pull from. So find yourself some decodable text that aligns with your scope and sequence or with the skills that you've taught that you want your students to be practicing with and get them applying what you're teaching. That's a really important piece. Oh, thank you for adding those, Jennifer. All right. In the vein of comprehension, no matter what text we're using, we want to make sure that we are using it effectively. So we're not just putting text in front of a student saying go, right? So some pre-reading things. We want to build a bridge, activate background knowledge, support that with visuals. Maybe we have to build some background knowledge if it's something the student lacks. Make connections to their home language, to their culture. So find out what they know, give them some supports, pre-teach some vocabulary they're going to encounter in that text, and then get them into the text. As they're reading, we want to keep them actively engaged. So things that might help with active engagement and not cause cognitive overwhelm would be things like chunking text. So of course, we don't want to give them a big long text if that's not, they don't have the stamina or the skills for that. So chunk it out. We can do read alouds. We want to model fluency. Think alouds, talking through how we're thinking about the text is important. Using graphic organizers to organize our thoughts and our writing before we do an actual writing assignment. Using sentence frames for discussion. So if we're asking a question from our multilingual learners, we want to make sure we're giving them the structure for the answer. And that's a really important piece. And then, of course, after we read, we want to help make sure that they are understanding that and they have an opportunity to analyze it. There are some good ways for us to do that non-linguistically. So if you're working with students who are not really great at verbalizing their language yet, you could have them draw a scene or sequence pictures in order to show that they understand the story. Maybe they act out what happened in the story. We can practice with oral language, have them retell. They can do that with peers. They can identify things they learned or a question they still have. I don't have time to talk about paragraph shrinking, but a really great research backed practice to really help students hone in on the most important main idea or the what details really matter and consolidate that into a single short sentence. Okay, tying in oral language. Now, of course, we've talked about oral language throughout. This is not like an isolated thing, like, and now we're going to do our oral language. Like, it's all in there as we're practicing vocabulary. We are doing oral language during dictation, during instruction, all of those things. But this is another fun thing you could do, conversation circles. This allows you to just really provide a safe space for your multilingual learners to start practicing producing the language. So give them some basic questions. So maybe they're newcomers and we're asking things like, what is your name? What language do you speak? How long have you been here at this school or in Utah or in the country? And then giving them sentence stems to answer those questions and practicing with peers. So circle up first, the teacher would model this first, then we would practice as a whole group, and then partner practice. And they can switch partners to practice speaking with additional peers in their class. So this is a great one, conversation circles. All right, last one I want to touch on real briefly is writing. And the reason, I mean, each of these could be their own presentation in and of themselves, but one of the things that I've really been focusing on is how integrated writing is with reading comprehension. Comprehension of everything is better when we have students writing about what they read. So specific things you can have them do is responding to a text with writing. So we looked at a lot of different ways students could respond to text, either non-verbally, verbally, in writing. That is a great way to help them not only practice their writing, but also to practice their comprehension, their vocabulary, their syntax. All of those things come and integrate back in. They could write a summary of the text, writing notes, just writing things that they notice, or the order of events helps it stick, or answering questions about a text in writing. Maybe it's as simple as a one-sentence response to a question. So writing is going to connect to reading. It's really going to help develop comprehension and strengthen it. And the fact is that all of these domains should all be integrated. They're not taught in these isolated pieces like we were going through today. They're all integrated. Oral language really is that foundation for it all, for writing, for reading, for speaking, listening, language. That's the piece. Your writing instruction needs to build, right? And as we build it, we're integrating all of these other domains of literacy. Speaking and listening, reading and writing. So kind of always be thinking about those 4 domains and how we can incorporate all 4 into our instruction. So just a quick recap of some of the shifts we discussed. In word recognition, we talked about making linguistic connections, dictation as a guided practice. In vocabulary, we had a few different things we discussed, and I'll share those GPT tools with you. In comprehension, using decodable text, explicitly teaching syntax, and some of those pre, during, and post reading support activities. Lots of oral language integration, conversation circles is one that we called out, and then connecting your writing to reading. So let's go ahead and wrap things up. I really appreciate your time tonight and letting me come and share more about multilingual learners. I could talk about it all day long, but of course I won't. Take a minute to reflect on something you learned, something you might want to learn more about. We didn't dig in too deep into some of those domains. And one thing that you are going to implement with your students. You can put it in the chat if you feel like it, or if you're watching the recording, you can just think about it. You could email it to me. Oh my gosh, I would love it. Okay, here's my email address. If you do want to reach out to me, I'm always happy to meet for lunch, talk about literacy. I'm all about making those connections and supporting each other as we're doing this work. And then that QR code will take you to a space where I just linked all of those GPTs and additional resources that you can access. So I'll leave that up for a minute, and I'll also go ahead and maybe we can share that out after with the recording, Jennifer. Okay. Thanks so much. I appreciate your time.
Got it. Thank you, Shannon. That was amazing. I love your energy and your asset-based approach to multilinguals, which they certainly deserve. So thank you, thank you. There is her ways to connect. You can follow her on LinkedIn. She puts out some great resources and content. So if you want more in the world of literacy and language, Shannon can be one of your new friends. She also has her own website that you can connect with up there for other ways to connect with Shannon and the amazing things she's doing to support our learners. As a kind of closer moving forward, in a couple of weeks, we have Dr. Katie Pace Miles, who honestly, Shannon, your highlight of how we learn words with the orthographic, phonological, semantic, and context processor, she's going to bring to life, and how we help kids to actually know words by sight, and how to really make words stick. So if that is something you're still working on with your students, come join Dr. Katie Pace Miles. Her and Molly Ness wrote the book Making Words Stick, and she'll talk about some really practical ways to help kids to hold on to words. And we need all four of those parts to really be able to map a word in our brains. So you'll have that available. We have posted this one on our Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn pages. So if you missed it, you can catch it there. And then in terms of what's coming up after that, you've got our flyer. We've got a few more for the wrap up the year. Amy Mahoney's going to come and talk about writing development. Dr. Nancy Walker's going to come talk about content area reading instruction. She's got some great strategies that she'll be sharing that are really practical and effective. And then Dr. Brown is going to come talk about diet reading, which is a 15-minute practice that you can do in your classroom to accelerate reading progress. So with that said, Shannon, thank you so much. We are so thankful for you taking the time to share your knowledge and expertise with us. And for those of you that want to stay connected, please connect with Shannon on LinkedIn. And for Reading League, if you want to be brought aware when these do get released for registration, follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram. Our handles are right there. Thank you. Have a great rest of your evening. We will send out the recording and the link that QR code goes to as part of the follow-up. Shannon, any final closing words?
Oh, nope. Happy teaching. Let's get everybody reading.
Let's do it. Thank you.
Thanks. Night.